Hi, I'm Sid Davis. I'm the Director of Music and Fine Arts at St. Luke's United Methodist Church, and this is our latest episode of Methodantics, Investigating Dusty Ideas. And today is a beautiful day and my windows are open, so you're probably going to hear my neighborhood, dogs barking and FedEx trucks coming, but it's just so beautiful. I can't bring myself to close the windows. How about you, Justin? Are your windows open?
Well, I don't even know. I'm in my office here at the church. I don't even know if I can open that window.
Probably not.
I could because it would be fill the atmosphere with fall smells and sounds and things. I am Justin Bair. I'm the Associate Director of Worship and Music at St. Luke's. And today on our episode of Methodantics, we are talking about church architecture. So the things that have fancy church names, and you may or may not know where some of those come from. Some of them may be obvious to you, some of them may not. So we're going to take a little stroll through your traditional church setting and see what these things are called, why they're called these things, and hopefully give you a chance to understand and appreciate a little bit better the space that you're in once we are indeed in this space again, because we will not forever be watching church on a screen.
That's right.
I so dearly hope. So the biggest, first, most obvious one is the sanctuary. Why it's called the sanctuary. So when I want to know more about something, I look at the etymology of that word. I look at kind of breaking apart that word and trying to figure out, what is the meaning of it, and then how does that help us to understand it in a historical context. And so I looked up, this is not something that just had in the back of my brain, but I was like, I bet that airy at the end of sanctuary means something, because I'm thinking, aviary, I don't know why that was the first one I thought of, because that's pretty obscure. Library. So it made sense to me that these aeries, these are receptacles, these are holders or containers almost. So library is a container of books, it's a receptacle. An aviary is where you keep birds. Sanctuary, the first part of that word being sanctu, is holy. It's Latin for holy. So I really love the idea. I've always talked about one of the things that I want to do with this job at St. Luke's is to help create a sacred space. And that's very literally what a sanctuary is. It's a holder of holiness. It's a container of holiness. And I love that a lot of what I get to do in my job is to shape that, to create that holder of holiness, that container.
Yeah, we're so lucky at St. Luke's because our sanctuary is a very, very beautiful place. And I know that for medieval architects and builders, the goal was to make people realize their size in comparison to the concept of God. And I think St. Luke's does that. It's a very awe-inspiring place. Very, very beautiful. I grew up, as I've said many times, not in the United Methodist Church, and it was the auditorium. It was not the sanctuary. So once again, as soon as I found my way to the United Methodist Church, so many of those things and these titles, these labels really spoke to me because it set it apart, as we have also spoken about. It set it apart as a different, special, sacred spot. So yes.
I think the very first time I remember considering the word sanctuary in a different context than just like the worship space, I think is in the Disney movie, Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it's been a hot couple decades since I've seen the movie, but I feel like there's a scene where a guy is running into the church and he's yelling, "Sanctuary, sanctuary," because he's fleeing from somebody.
Right.
And I thought, well, that's odd because I knew of it as the space, and it's not like you're going to walk into a gym and go, "Gymnasium, gymnasium." Like, why is he calling out this word sanctuary? And so from what I understand, a lot of that it was a place of protection. It was a place of, very literally, you would come in here to get away from everything that was out there. And thankfully, we live in a society where we don't need that same kind of religious protection, but we can still come in and enter this sacred space and get away from the things that weigh us down.
That's right. I believe in I don't know how long it carried forward, but there were the horns of the altar, which were actually little receptacles on the corners of the altar. And the belief was if someone was seeking sanctuary, if they could hold onto the horns of the altar, that's when they would be safe from attack or from people who were chasing them. That's right. We have a bunch of different aspects of that space, furniture, names that we so often just toss out. And I know that for people who don't really understand maybe what those mean or where they came from, it may be puzzling. And as I've said again, nothing has more lives than a question that goes unasked. So we're going to try to address some of those today. What's on your list, Justin?
So as we kind of enter into this space, one of those first rooms that many people would enter from would be the Narthex. And I remember, and a lot of these words, by the way, were words that I learned just over a year ago as I came to St. Luke's. Being trained by my predecessor, she would say, I'd say, well, where is this thing? Where does this take place? That's in the Narthex. Of course, I know where that is exactly in the church and what happens there in the Narthex. Have since learned that it is, it's the place where you enter. It's that kind of, some people might call it a foyer or, just that kind of entering space.
Anteroom.
Sure. And in some of my reading, I learned that a lot of the design of that space was for, really in a lot of ways, it was actually modeled after what you would think of as like the outer courts or outer space of the temple, the Jewish temple. And there were people that were allowed in there that weren't allowed into the inner courts. Namely, in many cases, women were not allowed in the inner courts, and they were part of the outer courts. And but also, what's I think a really important thing to grasp in the Gospels is that if you had any or a certain kind of ailment, most especially anything that was like disease oriented or injury oriented, if you're bleeding, you weren't allowed in the inner courts. And Jesus' miracles, his healing miracles, were for people that were not allowed to enter the court to be healed. They couldn't go through this healing rite, this healing process from the priests because they weren't allowed in, they were unclean. And they couldn't even go through these cleansing rites. And Jesus would heal people outside of the courts who were not allowed to come in and be healed and go through that process, which made me think that, Jesus' miracles were a very, very physical healing, but it was that process of beginning a spiritual healing for those people. And the Narthex was designed as a place where you would have a worship service, but a worship service for people that were, for whatever reason, unfit to enter that more sacred space, that sanctuary space. So they would have baptisms, they would have these services in the Narthex alone for people that couldn't otherwise enter that space.
And it's easy to think a word that's so outside the norm for, anything else we talk about, our homes or our offices or schools or whatever, a word that sounds like it comes from Greek because it does. Narthex is a sacred word or a holy word, and it's not. It just means a room outside.
Yeah, it kind of walks that line of like, is this a church word or like a space galactic word, the Narthex
right
ways or something? Yeah.
There are churches in Europe who actually call that space the Galilee because I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but the processional reenacts Jesus entering into Jerusalem from Galilee. So the processional is not just a parade in and of itself. It is it's a reenactment. It's an act of worship. Also, it's important to note that the weddings used to take place on a wedding porch outside the church. Weddings were not the business of the church, and they were done outside. And also sometimes called the paradise, which is a little puzzling. But the Narthex is just basically the room outside the sanctuary. And interestingly, once when I first started in full-time church work, one Saturday I was at the church and the phone rang in the office and I answered it. And it was a florist and they wanted to know if the anthrax of the church was open.
Oh gosh.
And I said, yes, it is. What else is on your list?
So once we enter the church through the narthex and we come into the sanctuary, but the sanctuary is really very encompassing because there's a lot that happens in the sanctuary. There's a lot of different things. So there's this space really marked by pews. It's where the congregation sits. What is that space called?
All of that's the nave, Nave, and it's the same root word that gives us the word navy. Navis, I think, is the original word. And it's supposed to remind us that the church is like a ship that protects us from the sea, it protects us from the storm. And in a lot of churches, a lot of older churches, if you look up, the exposed beams can look like the bottom of a ship inverted. And again, in Europe, especially in Norway or in the Scandinavian countries, oftentimes there's a model ship that hangs over the aisle, oftentimes near the front of the church, but it's a beautiful model ship that just hangs in the space to remind us that that sanctuary, that nave, protects us from the outside world, that church, that building is a sanctuary.
Interesting. So no umbilical associations with that word. That's a very
none whatsoever. Only marine.
That could be a point of confusion. So going through the nave, then we enter the beautiful marble steps of St. Luke's and we enter onto the chancel. I don't know why it's called the chancel.
Well, again, that's another one of those words. I won't lie, I have written down notes. It's just a space that is reserved for clergy and choir. As you and I have talked about before, especially in medieval times, Renaissance times, that area was reserved just for clergy and choir. And even today, you can go in churches and you're not, the average person is not allowed behind the altar rail. That whole chancel area is reserved just for worship leaders. And that's that whole area around the altar table. It has a lot of furniture in it. Lectern, Pulpit, which we'll talk about in a minute. It has small pews in which the worship leaders sit. It's just that area up there behind the altar rail. And while we were just passing the altar rail, let me say that it's easy to think of the altar rail as being really sacred also. And in fact, its original purpose was to keep the dogs away from the elements, because back in the day when it was very, very cold in those churches that were unheated, people would bring dogs with them to keep them warm. And that altar rail would keep dogs away from the elements. So I did have to close my windows because the bird was just a little bit too excited. I think the squirrel was taunting it. But we were talking about the chancel, and really that's pretty much all there is to say about it. It's reserved for worship leaders. Usually that's where you can find the choir. It's near the east end of the church, which in large churches, cathedrals were built facing east, because that's where the sun comes up. That's where Jesus is supposed to return from the east. Our sanctuary actually points, if you're facing the pulpit and the altar, you're facing south. But normally the chancel is near the east end of the building. And oftentimes it's near, if it was a cruciform church in the shape of a cross, the chancel would be near that crossing. So
is the terminology for chancel, is that irrespective of denomination or structure or something? So where the worship leaders are, that's in any Christian denomination, that's called a chancel.
Right. Now in churches that don't call themselves liturgical churches, which more about that in a minute, they probably would not refer to that area as, they call it the platform. They wouldn't necessarily refer to it as the chancel. That's probably a little formal for them. But the word liturgy just means work of the people. So anytime we get together and worship, it's liturgy. Mm-hmm. So it's not anything high and lifted up necessarily. It's just our work.
Yeah. So getting further into, you kind of continue walking forward, the sort of the largest feature, I guess, of the chancel is the choir loft. I remember a few years ago, we took a trip to France, and it's my first time in Europe, really. And we visited Notre Dame. And my wife always says that it takes me too long to go through museums because I don't like to just look at all the pretty pictures and keep going. I actually like to read this stuff, and it drives her crazy. And so I was reading about all the history of Notre Dame and all of the, like when it was originally built and the shape and how it was expanded and renovated and all this stuff over many, many years. And I was actually thinking with the fairly recent fire that was at Notre Dame that, I mean, that's going to be another marker in the history book that people are going to be reading about hundreds of years from now. But I thought it was interesting because they would sort of lay out the architecture of the building, even in its like most original state, where it was sort of like a large barn almost. And that there was an area, and it looked like it was kind of like, it was sort of on a second story, like a balcony almost, and a lot of it wrapped around that sanctuary area, or whenever it was expanded or moved, it was in different places. But that area was called the choir. And what I didn't find out from there that I was curious about was if it was called the choir because there were these groups of singers that were the worship leaders, and that's where they would go. And so this group of singers called the choir that's where they sat, or if the group of singers got their name from this area called the choir.
Right. I believe it's the former. I'm not really sure, but I believe it's the former. And as we were talking about earlier, there was a time when worship was really done for the congregant, not by the congregant. There was a time when the scripture was not written in a language of the people. It was, people couldn't read, and it was in a language they didn't speak. So worship was done very much for the worshiper, not by the worshiper. And so the choir got screened off with an organ screen or a rood screen. And visually, it was even a separate area for the worship leaders. So that was a place, that was a part of the church that the average congregant did not go. And I believe that choir gave its name to that area. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but.
So it sounds like it was designed in a lot of ways to be really an oral experience.
Oh, very much.
You would really just sort of listen in to what was taking place or what other people were doing.
That's right. And, it was, and the average worshiper couldn't read. And that's why stained glass windows tell stories, because that's how they learned Bible stories, was through those windows, not because they could read the Bible, because it wasn't written in their language back then. So yes, worship was very much experienced. There were smells, there was incense and singing, and it was very, very mystical experience.
So we probably can't do incense in our sanctuary, but what about just like some Yankee candles? We could I really feel like opening the windows and getting this fall feel really put people in a worshipful place. Yep. Sacred space, that's what I do. So also on the chancel, some of the most obvious aspects, you've got the pulpit, you have the lectern, you have those tiny pews, which could be referred to as tiny pews or sedilias, which I also did learn recently. A friend of mine taught me the name of that.
It's a terrible name. And a real Sedilia is actually a stone seat carved into the wall of a cathedral building. But yeah, it's just a place where worship leaders or acolytes would sit. Sedilias.
Those things before, and they weigh about that much.
They truly do. I don't know what they're made out of, but it's heavy.
So you have those two features. You have the pulpit and the lectern, and my guess is that the pulpit has traditionally been reserved for whoever's giving the sermon, but that would always just be that lead pastor, that senior pastor or clergy person. And the lectern is really anybody else who takes part in the service, be it a lay person or even an ordained person, but who is not giving the sermon.
Right. The word lectern means to speak. Again, it's not a sacred word, nor is pulpit. Pulpit derives its name from platform, something on which you would stand to speak. And it's usually bigger and lifted up higher. these days in contemporary sort of worship um, settings, pastors don't like to stand in a pulpit, so it's used less than it used to be. Um, Older members of St. Luke's will remember that we used to have hanging over it this sort of hood thing, which is actually a soundboard. And in churches before there was sound amplification, that the reason for that was so that the speaker's voice would bounce off that soundboard down to the listener and they could be heard better. And that's what that was.
It's interesting. It's kind of like the robes to me, where it was not originally supposed to be this
right,
set apart, can't go here kind of a thing. And so like you see the pulpit as a very exalted, it's a very high and lifted up thing, and like only the pastor gets to be there. But that's how people heard. Like if they were preaching from the ground, we had no amplification, you couldn't hear them, so they had to be up higher and have their sound go out, which is, and the whole acoustical shape of cathedrals, where you can be standing in the back and 100 yards away there's a group of people singing, and you can hear them all the way up and across in the back, and it's just so fascinating.
That's right. It's funny that things that are just necessary to the life in a building, in a space, becomes then later, the longer you do it, it becomes, revered and a holy thing. And really it was just practicality, like the altar rail.
So that's a lot of what you would experience on a Sunday morning in our space. So we like to end these with questions about us and to get to know us a little bit better. And so the question that we have today is, when is the last time you left the state of Texas, and why did you leave?
Well, I had to think about that when we were talking about it earlier, and it would have been January. I go every January, or have for many, many years, to New York to study with Alice Parker for about 4 days. And the last time I was out of the state of Texas was January, when I was up there in the cold weather and sitting around a table with other musicians, listening to an amazing 94-year-old woman speak.
So you sounded surprised when you said January. Is that, would you have, like, if everything were to have been, normal, would you have left the state more times since then?
Oh yeah, probably. I don't even remember what I would have done, but yes, I'm sure I would have done something, gone somewhere.
I know you often leave to go on like planning trips, like if there's another trip coming up. So
right, and I have a group of musicians I get together with once a year, which would have been this fall. We won't be doing that. So yeah, it's been a while since I've been out of this room, actually.
Yeah, slightly smaller than Texas.
How about you?
Not even in 2020. The last time I left the state, I had only been working at St. Luke's for like a week, and part of my overlap in training, and we left on a family vacation to go to Lake Tahoe. So we flew to California, and it was my then 3-year-old's first flight. And so we flew from Houston to Austin, and then Austin to Sacramento, and met some friends there. And a fun story about that is we were really trying to prepare Nora for that moment, because we knew that even adults, if they're flying for the first time or haven't flown in a while, can get pretty nervous. And we thought for sure this 3-year-old's just going to lose her mind. And so we were trying to tell her how like exciting it was and how powerful the plane was. And so, because we know when it starts going, it's going to shake a little bit. And so when we flew from Houston to Austin, she did well. And we had been like, explaining the whole process and getting her ready. And then by the time we flew from Austin to Sacramento, she was a pro. She knew what to expect. And so she knew, like, when the plane had turned and was about to start going, that it was a big moment. So she had her own middle seat there. And as soon as they kind of hit the thruster, she grabbed the handrails and goes, "Everybody, hang on!" And you could just hear like a radius of laughter all around the plane. It's her first time.
Very cute.
So
our youngest, when she flew by herself for the first time, and I was very worried about it and how it would go, she flew from Houston to Dallas. And after it was all over, she was back home. I was just checking on her, make sure she was okay. She's not afraid of anything, never has been. And I said, so Peyton, was there anything about the trip that was unexpected? I thought maybe there was turbulence or whatever. I was worried about that. And she said, yes, there was. I was not expecting those peanuts. So I knew everything was okay.
What a lovely surprise those were. Yeah, now we all expect them. Well, this was very insightful, and I hope that all of you watching, you get as much from this as I always have, talking to Sid about these things. If there's anything that you would like to know more about, questions that you have that you're afraid to ask publicly, you can just ask us personally, and I won't tell anybody as long as you don't tell anybody that I don't know this stuff. You can email me. My email is jbair@stluke'smethodist.org, or email Sid Davis, sdavis@stlukesmethodist.org. We'd be happy to work these into future Methodantics episodes.
That's right. Thanks, Justin. I'm going to open my windows back up. Hope you have a great day.
Enjoy the weather.
Bye.